Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Stephanie Baker, Communications Director for Celeste Williams for Arkansas. I'm joined this afternoon by Celeste Williams, family nurse practitioner who is currently running for Congress in Arkansas's 3rd District. Celeste decided to run for Congress when she realized that not every problem she sees in the exam room can be fixed in the exam room, and we're grateful that she's running. I'm also joined this afternoon by Shannon Watts, founder of Moms Demand Action. Shannon was a former communications executive who is currently a stay-at-home mom when the Sandy Hook shooting occurred, and that spurred her to do something, which was from her kitchen table to start a small Facebook group that has, as we know, has snowballed into this huge movement. Thank you both for being here with us this afternoon.
Glad to be here.
Thanks so much.
So before we get started with our planned conversation, I'd like us to take a quick moment to reflect on what's happening right now in our communities. Shannon, can you tell me what you're seeing in your community right now and talk a little bit about how we listen to these communities in pain and how we move forward?
Yeah, I live in the East Bay in California, and we've seen protests all over from San Francisco to Oakland to Napa to Walnut Creek. Americans are outraged and they're exhausted. And the last few weeks have been painful and infuriating across the country. And Americans are outraged. For far too long, Black and Brown communities have been killed, and people have died in their communities due to racism and white supremacy. And the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police has added even more urgency to the conversations around police violence and its disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities. Black men, in fact, are Black men and boys are 15 times more likely than white men and boys to be shot and injured. Gun violence is actually the leading cause of death in America for Black children. So, we are mourning right now these lives that are taken by racism and gun violence. And, whether it's George or Ahmaud or Brianna or James or Tony or Sean, David, all of these names that we are saying right now, we know there are countless similar stories that haven't made the news, that will never make the news. So part of our organization's mission is to end gun violence. And we're also listening and learning from groups that are doing this work in Black and Brown communities across the country. And we're doubling down on our efforts to support these organizations that have been working on the front line to end racial injustice and gun violence for decades. We know that a single incident of police violence can shatter the trust between police and their community and make community members less likely to reach out to police help for help when they need it. So there is so much more to be done. But one thing that we have been doing at Everytown and Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action are the grassroots arm of Everytown. We have been supporting modern use of force policies and laws that discourage lethal force and encourage de-escalation. So ultimately, this is the bottom line here is that there's no justice because George Floyd should be alive today. There's only accountability at this point. And that accountability looks like laws that respect the value of life, that promote de-escalation, and that work to increase community trust in our police. And we do that by holding these officers accountable.
Thank you. Celeste, recently the Harvard Public Health Review editorial board described racism as a public health issue. What do you think about that framing, and how can we combat racism on a federal level?
So I think that is absolutely a perfect framing. And I think sometimes when we frame things as a public health issue, it's easier to focus on doing evidence-based things to reduce those problems. And certainly from a federal level, I can't put forth legislation that makes individuals less racist. But what I can do is help put forth legislation that dismantles the systemic racism that is present in our society. And whether that is, looking to make sure that there's equal educational opportunities, that we have equal pay for equal work, that we really work to reduce the disparities in healthcare that are seen between Black and brown people and the average Caucasian, and making sure, and I think specifically about reducing maternal mortality rates and mental health parity, and even, looking at communities and sort of those determinants of health, making sure that there's sidewalks where people can exercise and that people aren't living in food deserts. And, that isn't just at the federal level. We have to be working towards those things at every level, if it's at a municipality, state, and federal. But certainly from a federal perspective, there's a lot of work to be done in that.
Thank you. So we're here today to talk a little bit about gun violence prevention here in Arkansas and then broader nationally. Shannon, I know you're familiar with Arkansas's story, our beginnings with Moms Demand Action and our success recently in preventing extremist gun legislation. Do you want to touch a little bit about the progress that you've seen us make here in Arkansas?
Yeah, I tell this story. I actually told it in my book, Fight Like a Mother, because I think it's such an important story about how if you do the unglamorous heavy lifting of grassroots activism, if you do the hard work, if you understand that it's a marathon, not a sprint, then you win. I mean, that is how you win, is by really never giving up. And I think Arkansas is such a good example of that. I would visit the same handful of very nice women in Little Rock the first few years of our organization starting. And the chapter didn't really grow or evolve. And I think that frankly was because people didn't think that working on gun safety was a great use of their time in the state of Arkansas. And what happened was we suffered a huge loss, which was a bill to force guns onto college campuses across the state flew through the state house. It was signed into law by the governor with the chief NRA lobbyist very proudly standing next to him. And it so outraged, particularly women and mothers across the state, that we grew from just a couple of local groups to over 24, almost overnight. And they used that newfound power, that strength, immediately to go back in and carve out an exemption so that guns would not be allowed in Razorback Stadium, which seems like common sense, but apparently it's not. And then the next year, in addition to becoming really a big political powerhouse, two of our volunteers ran for office and won. One of them, a retired nurse, who beat the lawmaker who put the guns on campus bill forward by 12 points. The year after that, which was last year, we were able to beat back stand your ground legislation twice, even though the Republicans have a super majority in the legislature. And after that win, some of the lawmakers, the Republican lawmakers, were interviewed by media, and they told them, these lawmakers said that the NRA's agenda was too extreme for the state of Arkansas, which, that's kind of mind-blowing. So that is the success that we've had in that state. And it's been such an inspiration to me and to our volunteers all across the country, particularly in the reddest of states, that we can and will win. And it really does show that organizing is a marathon, not a sprint. And if you play defense long enough, eventually you'll play offense.
Thank you. Yes, that was a wonderful legislative session this last year, and I enjoyed being one of those scarlet-shirted moms at the Capitol. So Celeste, when we're thinking about gun violence prevention, what are some steps that we need to take at a federal level? We've talked about some progress that we've made. What are our next steps? What do we need to do?
So I think we need to keep it simple and just have common sense solutions. And so I think one easy place to start is we want evidence-based solutions. And so we need to have more studying of gun violence and gun violence prevention. And certainly, low-hanging fruit, we shouldn't be printing guns on 3D printers. We should close background check loopholes. We need to make sure that we don't have guns in the hands of, people who perpetrate domestic violence, and make sure that we're keeping everyone safe as possible. And so I think those are all just really simple solutions that really shouldn't be partisan. And, most people support that.
Thank you. We do have very limited time. Shannon was very gracious to join us, so I'm going to bring this to an end pretty quickly, but I want to remind everybody that Celeste will be joined by Reverend Sharon Risher, who is a survivor of gun violence and the author of this book, For Such a Time as This. She'll be joining us via Facebook Live tonight at 6, so I hope all of you will join in to hear about gun violence prevention and about this movement from a survivor who's been personally touched. Shannon, I'd like to let you close up by asking you a question about, well, you mentioned your book. I have that one here too, Fight Like a Mother. I saw this book as kind of a playbook for like, so you're passionate about something, anything, how do you get involved? And to bring this conversation back to where we started, I know you're familiar with Brenda Moss, who's also a survivor of gun violence. She posted on Facebook a few days ago, who's going to be the mom who starts a movement from her kitchen table to combat racism. So what is your advice for people who are passionate and want to get involved in this fight? What should they do?
Well, I think first of all, you have to decide you want to get off the sidelines on any issue you're passionate about. And what makes me so excited is to see volunteers like Celeste running for office, understanding they need to move from not just shaping policy, but to actually making it. I wrote the book for many reasons, but mainly because I wanted it to be a manual that people could see how we started as an organization. They could see that they could do the same thing. If I could do it, certainly anyone could do it. And people can do this in their neighborhood, their community, their state. But I also wanted it to be part of manifesto, which was, it is so important. I actually think there's a moral imperative right now for women to run for office. And I don't care if it's coroner or sheriff or city council or school board, Congress, whatever it is. I really do think the saying is true, which is, if you don't have a seat at the table, you are probably on the menu. And women are in this country over and over again. I mean, the fact that the Violence Against Women Act is still sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk a year later and it hasn't been reauthorized. And the reason is because the gun lobby is grading lawmakers. They don't want the provision in there that prevents stalkers and dating partners from having easy access to guns. So I just, I can't stress enough that because this is a democracy, all of our voices matter. And if someone has an idea and they're passionate and they're caring and they're considerate, then they can run a successful organization or movement or campaign, whatever it is. And I guess the last thing I would say is, I've spent a lot of time with elected officials in the last almost 8 years. And I think that women assume they're not qualified, or they don't have enough time, or they don't know enough, or whatever it is. And the idea that the people who are serving us want to hear us and care about what we think isn't necessarily the truth. And so if you are a concerned citizen, if you are curious, if you are passionate and committed, if you are a caring, involved citizen, you are more than qualified. In fact, you may be more qualified than the people who currently represent you. And I just think it's so incredibly important that everyone gets involved, either in activism or thinking about running for office.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you for joining us. I'm sure the people of Arkansas and in District 3 specifically are very glad to hear from you. Celeste, would you like to close us out?
I want to just say thank you so much, Shannon, for joining us and for all the work that you've done. And I want to thank all the people who are watching right now for tuning in. And I would love to just leave with a short little call to action. Maybe you're not the person that feels like you're going to start a movement to end racism, but you can start a movement to reduce racism in your little circle. And you can start with people who look just like you, and start with your friends and family members. And if you hear them say something in those quiet corners, you can always say that you don't agree with that, and you can speak up and speak out. And it starts with us. I think it has to start with us as individuals, and it is not the job of our friends of color to end racism. It is our job to end racism. amongst our friends and family members. And I think we can all do our part.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Remember to tune in again on Facebook Live tonight to hear from Reverend Sharon Risher. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Celeste.
Thank you. Good luck, Celeste. We'll be rooting